And now, my friends, a tour of the Baroque and art stuff as fast as I can do it because I don't have much time to get it done. And I don't want you to leave this semester without most of the Baroque notes under your belt. So hang on tight. Baroque was not a term that originally had a very nice meaning to it. It meant irregular, contorted, grotesque. But the thing to remember about Baroque art is that it's kind of like the difference between the Greek classical and Hellenistic. In more modern art, the Renaissance is classical, they're perfect bodies at rest, versus the Baroque, where you have motion and emotion, kind of like you did in the Hellenistic form of the Greek art. Whether what Baroque is sort of up for debate. It's mostly the 1600s, probably up to about 1750. If you add the Rococo, for sure it's up to 1750. Some regular historians would not call Baroque an era at all. They just call it the end of the Renaissance, that this is just kind of tacked onto the Renaissance. But for art historians, it's considered a distinct period of its own because the art itself is so much different than what's being done during the Renaissance, where you really do have perfect bodies at rest as opposed to all this motion and action and emotion. Um, Baroque is started in Rome, but it spreads throughout Europe. It's very interesting stuff. It really does show action and emotion more so than what you would have seen in the Renaissance. So I think the best thing I can tell you to do is to think about the Greeks and think about the difference between classical and Hellenistic, and apply those to the Renaissance and the Baroque in a parallel fashion. Perfect bodies at rest versus motion, action, emotion. I've cut down a lot of these notes so I can get through them all, but there are some major painters and ideas we cannot get away without looking at. And the first one is Caravaggio. His real name is Michelangelo Merisi de Caravaggio, but the name Michelangelo was already taken, obviously. He was born near Milan, so up north of Florence, kind of. His name is taken from that area. De Caravaggio. Caravaggio is the name of the town that he would have lived in. But he's called Caravaggio because Michelangelo was already taken. He's really well known for his use of tenebrism, and we have to talk about that because when we talked about Leonardo, we talked about the idea of chiaroscuro, or the idea of modeling and things moving from lighter to darker to make things look rounded. Tenebrism is related to that, but it's not the same. Tenebrism is the use of stark contrast between light and dark. It's not a gradual sort of gradient from light to dark or from dark to light. It is really bright white or really white light sections next to very dark sections, and that's called tenebrism. Probably his most important work is the St. Matthew canvases, and there's one in particular that we're going to look at called The Calling of St. Matthew. It shows a world that he knows. You have people in it who are dressed like Renaissance folks who lived in the late 15 and early 1600s. They're wearing the clothing of the people of Rome in the 15 and 1600s. They look like the people he would have hung out with, and he was really well known for using people that he knew as his models. Technically 3 paintings that are part of the Contarelli Chapel at Santa Luigi del Franceschi in Rome. You're looking at 2 of those 3. The third one would be on the wall to your right. And what you're seeing when you look at this piece, the piece that is the Calling of St. Matthew is the one on the side wall, this one right here. When you stand up, you would, like this railing would come about waist high, so you can get a sense of how large this painting is. So this is the Calling of St. Matthew, this very important canvas. It's really large, 11 feet by 11 and a half feet. And so the story goes that Matthew was called to be one of Jesus's first disciples. But Matthew was a tax collector, and tax collectors were Jews, but they were employed by the Romans. So the other Jewish people considered them to be traitors to their people. So when Jesus calls Matthew as a disciple, Matthew is aghast, like, you would choose me? Why? Because everybody hates me. How can I possibly convince anyone to follow you? This is the story of Jesus choosing Matthew, but in a much more contemporary way for the 1600s than one would have seen in ancient Palestine. To your right is Jesus. We know that it's Jesus because he's pointing. And if you look very faintly above his head is a little line, a white line, that is a halo. And that's what's becoming those big gold halos. In this instant, you have just this little line that suggests that he's holy. and he points with a hand toward Matthew. There are a bunch of pointing devices in this particular piece. So Jesus' hand points to Matthew. The light itself points to Matthew and illuminates his face most. Matthew points to himself. And then you have this sword. The guy who's sitting with his back to us has a sword on his belt, and it also points at Matthew so that we know who Matthew is. He's asking the question, me? He's been at this table counting money and getting ready to gamble with friends, I think. But you have all this use of light, the darknesses, and then the bright lights. And then also in this piece, sort of an interesting bit is in the window, you have sort of a prefiguration of Christ's death. In the window, you have a cross. It isn't an equal because he's darkened out so much of the top of the window. It looks more like a cross than what you would see when you saw regular mullions in a window. So it's a really interesting piece. I'd like to talk about it a lot longer and have a lot more to say about it. But you have the basics of this, right? All the people sitting at that table, they are all dressed like contemporary Romans. Jesus is dressed like a Palestinian. The man that he is with is dressed like a Palestinian, but they're calling St. Matthew to follow Jesus. Of course, you've seen Caravaggio before, right? When we, in our very first set of notes in Humanities 1, we talked about this particular portrait where it's sort of autobiographical. This is the David slaying Goliath, and the head of Goliath is a self-portrait of Caravaggio as an older man. We think that the picture of David is also a self-portrait of Caravaggio as a younger man, which is sort of interesting as well. Caravaggio is somebody who is very, very popular in his own time, and his paintings were appealing to both Protestants and Catholics because they were religious for sure, but they also have sort of a lay Christianity, the idea that you don't have to be trained to understand them, you don't have to be a theologian to get all of the images and stuff. And the fact that people are dressed like they were dressed in the time that made people able to sympathize and identify with the people in the painting. That's what made these really popular with the contemporary people of Caravaggio. He was so popular that when he was working on a painting and he would open up his studio for people to see it, people would line up for blocks to look at it because he was really that good even as a young man. But he had a big ego. The man was a fighter. He got into a lot of brawls. He drank too much. He was a problem. He was not an easy individual, but he painted like an angel, and people really loved the stuff that he did. He had a really large influence on a lot of different artists, including Rembrandt, who's going to be painting shortly thereafter in the Protestant North. The way Rembrandt lights his things is really very highly influenced by Caravaggio. And Rembrandt had gone south to Italy and studied the artists who were working there. So that's kind of where he got that stuff. He only signed one work in his entire career. It's a pretty large work. And here it is. This piece is called Beheading of St. John the Baptist. Big piece. And he has signed his name in the blood coming out of John the Baptist's neck, which is kind of gory and awful, but this is the sort of thing that he did. I would commend to you, and I'll even put the link of it up on the classroom site. There's a really good video called The Power of Art on Caravaggio that tells you a lot about his life and tells you a lot about his art, and it's worth every second of watching it if you really like art and you especially like painting. One of the artists that Caravaggio most influences is a woman by the name of Artemisia Gentileschi. Yes, a girl painter. She's the first important known woman painter. Her father had been a painter. She apprenticed under him, and when she became too good for him to be able to teach her anything else, she apprenticed for another painter, which I'll talk about in a second. She primarily paints biblical heroines, women heroes, and that whole tenebristic style where you have darks and lights and light as a pointing device. Those are very similar to what Caravaggio is doing, and that's what she does as well. So this man that her father apprenticed her to raped her, and she was appalled, and she took him to court. But she couldn't take him to court because she was a woman, and nobody believed women. She wasn't even allowed to testify in court. Her father had to take the suit for her to court, and he had to make the charges about it. In the end, they decided that probably this guy was guilty, but they didn't punish him in any way. And she was so furious and bitter that she spent most of her life painting pictures of women in power over men like this one. This piece is one of three that she does of Judith and her maidservant with the head of Holofernes. And I mean, for that to make any sense, you have to know this story. And if you're a Protestant, you don't know this story because this book does not appear in your Bible. But in the Old Testament, there is a story of Judith, who is a heroine to her people. She's a widow. She's very beautiful. She's very wealthy. And her town is being laid siege to by the Assyrians. Remember, they're the big, bad, mean ones. And they are led by the general Holofernes. And they're being starved out. That there's a siege and they're being starved out. And so, and the town fathers are doing nothing about it. So Judith, this beautiful, wealthy widow, um, tells the town fathers that she's going to do what she can, but they have to tell the people at the gate to let her out when she says and to not ask any questions. So one night, just after dusk, she and her maidservant go to the gate and they let them out. And she goes down to the stream to wash down by the camp of the Assyrians. Of course, she's captured and she's beautiful and she's taken to the general, Holofernes, who's the head of all this army, and he falls in love with her. Oh, she's just so beautiful. And you know, men out in the field, they haven't seen women much, and he decides that he kind of would like to have a little bit of that for himself. But he doesn't want to be a rapist, and so she tells him that she will stay with him on the condition that every evening she's allowed, because it's part of her religion, that she's allowed to go down to the stream and wash. And he agrees to this. The second night, they have a lovely dinner, and she kind of puts him off, and nothing happens. The third night, he's going to make her pay up, and she knows that this is the case. So they drink, and she gets him very, very, very drunk until he is essentially helpless, and then she takes his sword and she beheads him with it, and he's too drunk to be able to fight back. In this particular scene, you can see the maidservant stuffing his green head into a bag. She and her maidservant then stuff his head into the bag and they go down to the stream to wash. And they've been told not, and the soldiers have been told to leave them alone because this is their religious thing that Holofernes has agreed to. And so instead of washing at the stream, they go back up to their city and they, knock on the gate and the people let them in. And the next morning when the Assyrians wake up, there is the head of their general on a pike at the gate. And it so frightens the Assyrians how did this happen that they break camp and they leave. And Judith has saved her people by doing this. This is one of the pieces that she does, and this is one that's in the United States, so you could see it at some point in your lifetime. This is a second version of it that she does, that's at the Uffizi in Florence. I think it's a little gorier and a little scarier in some ways because he's in the process of being beheaded. He hasn't had his head actually chopped off just yet. It's beautifully painted. The colors are beautiful. The bedclothes look like the Venus d'Urbino. They look real. They look like you could reach out and touch silk and velvet and things like that. This is, like I said, she does this painting at least 3 times. Down in the bottom, I give you the picture of Jael and Sisera. Sisera was, I think, the general of the army that was trying to beat the Hebrews, and he ran away because their army was getting beaten, and he went to this woman's tent, and she recognized him, but he didn't know that. And he asks for refuge, so she feeds him, and he falls asleep, so she drives a tent stake through his brain. So, I mean, she's looking at some really violent pieces, but she likes to show women power over men, which is pretty important in general. It's about her life, obviously, but it's biblical, so nobody really holds it against her exactly. She marries, she has a family, but she complains all her life that even though she's a better painter than most men, she doesn't get paid as much as they do. Ceiling painting has become a big deal. You know, Michelangelo does that great ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, and now everybody wants a great ceiling. And they're going to use a lot of that trick of the eye, that trompe l'oeil thing. There are a couple of major ceilings I want us to look at. I'm going to zip through these slides pretty fast. They're interesting. One of them is a bigger deal than the other in some ways, but there are 2 major ceilings. This first one, the Annibale Carracci piece, he does for a wedding in the Farnese Palace. The Farneses were related; they were bishops and cardinals in Rome. I think one of the Farneses becomes a pope. But he paints this ceiling fresco for a wedding celebration. So here's the picture of that ceiling, and it looks like he's painted a number of different paintings on the ceiling, and they all have frames on them. There are no frames there. Nothing there is 3-dimensional. If you look up to the top and on the right, you'll see that man with his arm above his head. He looks sculptural. He doesn't exist as sculpture. He is flat. This is a barrel vault that is a flat barrel vault. There is no three-dimensionality to it, but some of these frames look like they stick up off of this, off of the surface. It looks very three-dimensional because he has created it to look that way because that is the style of the time. These things get crazy by the time you get to this guy, Da Cortona. He does this work, The Glorification of the Reign of Urban VIII, and it's supposed to show you, this piece shows you the difference between the high Baroque and the regular Baroque Classic. What we looked at last was Baroque Classic. That was in the Karachi ceiling. But this high Baroque stuff, it becomes just outrageous. It's so large. It becomes really busy, sort of frightening in a way because there's so much going on in this piece. He says that art should be like epic poetry with a lot of extra to it, a lot of actors and a lot of episodes, and it should be elaborate, and it should have sensuous appeal, and that it should just be something else. Well, this is something else, and it's really busy. So this is Pietro da Cortona's Glorification of the Reign of Urban VIII. So it's crowning the Pope. You can see, well, there's Jesus at the bottom of this ceiling. This actually goes, you're looking at a rectangular ceiling and some of the stuff that goes down the sides of it, but it all looks, well, it is what it is. I just wanted you to see how busy and how extra it is. There's so many things going on. It's supposed to be like epic poetry, big, lots of elaboration. It's quite interesting. Architecture changes a bit during the Baroque era from what was the Renaissance. We have Carlo Maderno as sort of our most important architect that shows up at first. He's given the task of completing St. Peter's. The Pope decided that central plan of St. Peter's that Bramante had done wasn't big enough. He wanted more, he wanted bigger, he wanted something that looked more like a Gothic cathedral with a long nave. So he hires Maderno to create that nave and create a face to the building that creates sort of a frame of that huge dome that Michelangelo has built. And so Maderno does that. And the St. Peter's Basilica that we see today is the one that was designed by Carlo Maderno and finished by Carlo Maderno. You've seen this picture before, but what you've got to know is that this little bit right here that is the nave and this bit right here that was the facade did not exist prior to Maderno building them. It was all a central plan around that dome, and that's what you had. Remember, right here is the Sistine Chapel, that little building, and this is what you had. Now, you didn't at the time. You did not have the colonnade in St. Peter's Square, which we'll talk about shortly. But this is the building that Maderno finishes during the Baroque era, and is the building that stands there today. It is a great big building. This is the nave. You're looking down the nave toward the altar, toward the high altar. And that thing that sits there in the middle is the high altar. That's called a baldacchino. We'll talk about that. This bit right here is a baldacchino. What you should know about it is that it's 100 feet tall, about 8 stories high. When you look at this piece, there's writing all along this gold wrap here at the top. Those letters are 7 feet tall. This is the largest church in Christendom. There is a larger church in Islam, but this is the largest church that Christianity has, and it is a big, big church. And what you can see about it is also really ornate. There's all of this gold and marble and all of these really beautiful things that are a part of this church. A second and pretty important architect that we have is a guy by the name of John Lorenzo Bernini, and he's the one who designed St. Peter's Square, which is in front of the Basilica. It includes those 2 colonnades that I talked to you about in the last picture. I'll show them to you again. And he likens those to the motherly, all-embracing arms of the church. They're meant to funnel in the believers and funnel them into the church itself. Bernini builds this very large area it holds today even 300,000 people in standing room only, so outside of St. Peter's Square. There are Doric pillars that go 4 deep, all the way from the front to the back of the colonnade, and there are statues of saints and martyrs on top of the colonnade. He also designs the big fountain in the middle of St. Peter's Square. So here's that same picture again. This thing here, and it's matching one on the other side, is the colonnade. There are 4 Doric pillars through there. You have all these little things that stick up. Those are all life-size statues of saints. There are people standing in St. Peter's Square. Those little dots are people. So you can see how they can fit 300,000 of them there. You also have, this is the statue that Bernini designs, or the fountain that Bernini designs. That's in the middle of the square. This is a picture that I've taken as I stand in front of, kind of on the front porch of St. Peter's Basilica. So you can see the colonnade on either side. You can't even see, it's so big that you can't even see the insides of the curve on both sides, but you can see the obelisk in the middle of the fountain that Bernini designs, and you can see a bit of the square, and you can see people standing in the square in this picture as well. Bernini is also responsible for creating the canopy, it's called a baldacchino, that the main altar sits under, and it all sits underneath the dome that Michelangelo created. So right above this thing in the middle there that's all in bronze is the dome of Michelangelo. So it sits directly above that, and directly beneath it a bit is the tomb of St. Peter himself. This baldacchino is about 8 stories high, 100 feet. The bronze that was used to create it, in part, was stripped from the Pantheon. Remember when we studied the Pantheon in first semester, I told you that there was like a rosette in each of those coffers in the ceiling of the Pantheon. Those were stripped and melted down, and that bronze was used in part to make this baldacchino, which has these sort of undulating, twisted pillars all the way up, angels on the 4 corners. It's really quite phenomenal to see it up close and personal. There's one other really important architect from the Baroque era. His name is Borromini, and he and Bernini were great rivals in architecture. Borromini was somebody who was emotionally unstable. He was pretty secretive. Bernini was somebody who got a lot of attention and was given a lot of awards and things, and a lot of praise for his work. Borromini was very different in how he designed things, and he was a much better architect than Bernini was, because Bernini's structures tended not to stand up very well for very long. Borromini, however, creates these really extravagant facades that have a lot of undulations to them. So they are like waves across in the marble. They are, as it says, convex and concave surfaces that sort of make the front of a building wavy looking. This piece is the piece that's on the AP 250, and it's called San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane. This is the facade of it, and you can see how it sort of bumps out and then recedes, how it undulates. It's built on a really weird sized lot, and it goes around a corner. So this part that you see that's dirty on the left-hand side of the picture is still part of the building. It hasn't been cleaned. That goes around the corner of this space. And you can see, lots of ovals. And that's part of what makes this an interesting piece, is because he designs the whole floor plan even on the basis of an oval, which is unheard of at the time. And you can really see that here when you look at the floor plan of San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane. You can see how the convex concave bit on the facade work. You can see how it goes around that corner, but you can see the floor plan as well is based on an oval. This is the dome that you're looking up into in the same piece. He's created, that's all like plaster work that creates those little coffers that you have there, and those coffers also create crosses in them. You can see them if you look closely enough. You'll see one right here, but they're more the Greek cross. They're very interesting, and the stuff that he does is very unusual, but really structurally very sound and very interesting and different for its time period. Bernini, as great an architect as he was, eventually commits suicide in his 40s, I believe. And part of it is because he is not acclaimed and Bernini is. So we come back to sculpture, and there it is, Bernini again. If Bernini does anything really beautifully, he does sculpture the best. And his statue of David really gives us the distinction between what is Baroque and what is Renaissance, because what you have with this particular sculpture of David is action and movement, and he belongs to the space in which he stands. He seems to move within the space that he inhabits. It is not self-contained. And when you look at a Bernini sculpture, it is so incredible. I can't begin to tell you how much I love his stuff, because it's so detailed and so beautiful. So this is the statue of David, and you can see that he is in the process of throwing that stone. Remember, when you look at Donatello's David, he's already slain Goliath. If you look at Michelangelo's David, he's just standing there looking off in the distance like he's going to slay Goliath. In this particular piece, David is in the middle of throwing the stone that is going to slay Goliath. And I think I gave you this close up of the rope there so that you can see the kind of detail that he is putting into everything that he's carving. Every single strand of every single string that goes into that braided rope is a part of this marble. And you know, if you look at things like his shoulders and his musculature, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that isn't actual flesh because it is so realistic. And this is one that's meant to be walked 360 degrees around so you can see all of it. This is another piece that's at the Galleria Borghese where you would see the David that he does. Borghese was one of the popes and an important cardinal as well in Rome, and this is his villa. There's a lot of he was one of Bernini's big patrons, so Bernini does a lot of work for him. This is the Rape of Persephone when Hades takes Persephone to hell, and it's an interesting piece as much as anything else. And I don't know if you can tell from this picture. There's another picture that I've got for you next, but he's hauling her off. And when you look at his stuff, what's interesting, again, another piece that's meant to be looked at, you're meant to walk 360 degrees around it so that you can see it from every angle, because you might not notice that down in the corner are the hounds of hell themselves. It's Cerberus, who has 3 heads and he's baying at them. What I really want you to notice about this, because on this picture you can really see it, is Bernini has made marble look like flesh. Look at the imprints of Hades' fingers in her thigh. This is marble that has been made to look like it is giving to the pressure of fingers. And if you look, you can even see it in his index finger on the that holds her torso. There's a place where his finger indents the flesh of this woman, but this is all stone that he's made it from. It is phenomenal to look at his stuff. Bernini falls from grace, and he goes away to France, and he eventually comes back, and he does this piece. He's a kind of a washed up uh, artist, and the Cornaro family hires him to make them the sculpture for their chapel. And so in this chapel, he's really happy because he can merge architecture and sculpture and painting in some ways. He made early sets for theater pieces. In fact, Bernini liked to do that. This piece is called The Ecstasy of St. Teresa, and it's a very interesting piece, sort of an odd little thing. It isn't little, and it's also not odd, but Teresa of Avila was a nun who had visions, and she apparently levitated during her visions as well. She writes about this in her autobiography. This is what she writes. Look at this sculpture. Think about it while I'm telling you about it, right? She says, I saw in his hand a long spear of gold, and at the point there seemed to be a little fire. He appeared to me to be thrusting it at times into my heart and to pierce my very entrails. When he drew it out, he seemed to draw them out also, and to leave me all on fire with the great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan, and yet so surpassing was the sweetness of this excessive pain that I could not wish to be rid of it. That's very interesting. So he has made in stone the writings of Teresa of Avila, who says what she says in that piece. So here is the angel. It's sort of interesting because the angel smiles at her while she is kind of laying back and moaning, and he's lifting the edge of her robe as if to kind of look underneath it. The marble that she's made of is highly polished and shines, and it's beautiful. She sits on a rock that's not been polished at all, and you'll notice that the garments of the angel have also not been polished, and his wings have not been polished, although his body has. In the back of them is this set of these golden rays that are coming down. It's the light of heaven coming down. And when you look at this piece, what's interesting about it is above where you cannot see, it's behind that pediment that frames all of this, is a window through which sunlight would come and actually illuminate those rays. So it has its own sort of dramatic flair to it as well. And when you look at this, the other thing that you can't see in this picture or even in the inset picture, which I'd like for you to be able to see, is there's the Cornaro family up watching all of this go on. It's a great piece to look at. It's very dramatic. It is very cool. And it is considered really his most important piece of all. A little bit beyond your 30 minutes, but only for a really, really important artist. When I'm talking about Italy, I'm also going to talk about Spain here because they're the most alike at this point. The Spanish didn't have their own kind of style very much, so they import Italian painters for a really long time. Their court painters tend to be Italian after El Greco, and so there isn't a lot of their own regional style for a while, and then there is. And the artist who is the most important coming out of Spain is Diego Velázquez, even to this day, one of the most important Spanish artists ever to exist. He was painting some still lifes. The Dutch called them breakfast pieces, and he creates scenes of people eating and drinking, and not religious scenes. He creates images that show inanimate objects that are meant to be symbolic. One of his earliest pictures is this piece called The Water Carrier of Seville, which is really beautiful. In a way, it shows how he understands characters, how he understands people, and can paint them that way. And it also shows a little bit of Caravaggio's influence on his style in terms of the lights and the darks. It's not quite as stark as Caravaggio, but it's awfully close in some ways. This is the water carrier of Seville. And I just want you to look at the water carrier and ask yourself, which person is the water carrier? And look at those jugs and to think about this piece. So if you look at this piece, what you ought to see is the water carrier is the older man. He's somebody who's in poverty. He's got a tear in his cloak. He's somebody who's clean, but he's not well dressed. He's not someone who seems to have any kind of money. And he is handing a crystal goblet of water, this beautiful, it looks cold and clear water, off to a little boy who's got on a white collar and a dark vest over it. Somebody who's clearly someone who does have some status and authority and some money. And he's young. You've got these contrasts between young and old, rich and poor. But look at how the two jars of water also sort of mimic these two characters you're looking at. You have the large jug by the water carrier himself that's very unadorned. It's a pretty functional terracotta jar that has nothing fancy about it, next to this smaller jar, next to the rich kid who's wearing fancy clothes, and it has all kinds of fanciness to it as well. I mean, I think this is just brilliant, the thing that he's done here, create these contrasts in this piece. Who's the ghost image looking at the two of them? Don't know. And finally, Diego Velázquez's magnum opus. This is his most important painting of all time. It's a huge piece, 10 feet 5 inches by 9 feet tall, or 9 feet wide, I guess it's 10 feet tall. And it's called Las Meninas, or the Maids of Honor. And it's him, he became the court painter for the king. And what you've got here is what appears to be a portrait of the Infanta, their daughter, their oldest daughter. And she's there in the middle in the white dress, and there are all these people around her. Most of the people around her are actually little people, dwarves, if you will. That's the inappropriate label for little people. But oftentimes in royal families, they surrounded their children with dwarves because children needed adults to supervise them, but the king and queen didn't want them to look up to adults. They wanted them to be able to feel like they were in command, even though they're small people. The king has this painted, and there is his favorite dog in the bottom corner. That's there, and all the people who appear there are here for a reason. Velázquez paints himself in the painting. He's on the left-hand side with the cross on him. The cross is added after his death as a tribute to who he is. There is, in the back door, there's a man standing there who is an important advisor to the king. He wants him kept as well. So this is sort of a group portrait. It's got a self-portrait in it. But even more interesting than that is look back by that door. To the left of the door, there is something there with a man and a woman in it, and that is actually a mirror. If you think about where Velázquez is standing and where the canvas is, he isn't painting the Infanta at all. He's looking at something else, and what he would be looking at are the king and queen who are looking on this scene of their family. It's kind of a meta idea of this piece. It's the first time, well, I say the first time. If you think about Van Eyck, he uses a mirror as well. But this is the first time that somebody has used a painting to think about painting and what's real and what's not real, what's actually there, what's not actually there, what is Velázquez actually painting. And in the very, very back, you can see these huge canvases that are canvases Velázquez paints of artists that they're like copies of artists that he really liked. So there are all these things going on in what appears to be like a nothing burger of a painting. Like, would you hang this up in your living room? Probably not. What does it mean? I don't know, except that it does. It has so many other things going on in it. Velázquez is somebody who is copied, and his ideas are copied over and over again. Art historians classify this as the most important piece of art to ever have been made because it influences so many things after it. There it is, Italy and Spain, 34 minutes, almost 35.